You're listening to Rhythms of Grace, a podcast of Grace Fellowship Church in McClenny, Florida, with pastors Nathaniel Simmons and Joel Griffiths. You can find out more about Grace Fellowship Church at www.gfcbaker.org. I usually have my Grace Fellowship mug to show, but now I've just got my dad
mug,
my Father's Day.
Are you
whenever
gonna?
That was.
Can you get that like engraved with 2 different dates now?
Oh yeah. I guess although EST means established, right? So
Yeah,
that always my
your
fatherhood
firstborn.
first started in 2022. So
That's right. It's been 2 weeks that we've been off.
Yeah.
1 week we just had crazy conflict stuff, and then last week I was at the beach.
was
and
the last time we recorded, was it also one of my messages, or
no,
was there one of yours?
I don't remember now.
I can't remember either.
So we missed. Yeah, I guess so, because we missed 2 of mine, and then we're back to you. So, and I'm up to
Sorry
be
about that.
No, that's all right. I'm up to be the interviewer again. I will say I came back with a cold, and hopefully there's not too much sniffing going on, but there will probably be some. Let's see, Joel.
College football's back.
Man, neither one of us are happy about it.
No. Yeah, Florida State stinks.
Everybody's saying this is Virginia Tech's year. Well,
But the Gators might stink too, so
that's
maybe
the
we
one
can be happy
redeeming.
about that.
The one redeeming thing is the Gators.
Yeah. Well, you guys played hard though against Vanderbilt. It was a good game.
You guys played hard, and then you had to finish the sentence with against Vanderbilt.
Yeah. Well,
so-
we're in the same boat. So
We'll see. We'll just see. I don't know. Maybe I'm a curmudgeon. I feel like this new era of football, when your team changes every year and your quarterbacks are there for a year and they're out the next year, it's just less inspiring to me.
Yeah. Which last year it was great for us because we got all kinds of fantastic, players from the transfer portal. But then this year, I don't know, something's not right. That's all I know.
It was great, but there's something to me about old school football where you come back and you're like, I already know these guys, and I want to see how much they improve. And I'm invested. So the year begins. I don't know anybody on my team. Now, Virginia Tech had a couple guys come back that were good last year, but it's like you have to learn your team all over again every year.
How do you pronounce that guy's name?
No doubt. Florida State is just that's ridiculous. So I don't know. I find it to be, maybe in a few years I'll quit complaining about it, but right now I don't love it anymore.
Yeah.
But I do think that's just a part of being old. I had a birthday last week, and so I have 1 more year's worth of complaining rights built up into me, and I'm like a little bit more curmudgeonly than I was the year before. So, all right. I want to start with your introduction, which really was not connected to your passage at all. It was just a word on preaching.
Yeah.
And you shared this illustration from Charles Spurgeon where he talked about a man who had made this fountain and put it in the middle of the city, and he put a little cup out by the fountain, and everyone who came by the fountain could dip the cup in and drink of it. Germs weren't a big issue there, but they found their thirst quenched, and it was a delight to all the people. And along comes somebody with these complaints that, that fountain could have been built better or done better. And he said, you'll probably feel this way about my book. There will be people who come along and make complaints, but I hope that it's a fountain where people's thirst can be quenched, regardless of whatever failures there are. And that was about All of Grace, which happens to be, in my mind, one of the, I don't want to say one of the best, but it's up there as a great explanation of the Bible, of the gospel, and how to be saved. But even he thought, there will be people who won't like it.
Yeah.
So how
Even
did
the
that?
great Spurgeon himself.
Yeah. So
Let
me see if I have that.
I had I was listening to an audiobook of it actually, and then I just found a text version of it online because it's
Here's
obviously
my copy
free.
of it.
Yeah, yeah, seems really good.
And there's
so
all
far.
sort of different editions of this because I think it's so old now. You can anybody can print it, but some incredible analogies, especially my favorite parts of this. And I don't know if you've gotten here yet, but when he tries to explain what faith is, and it's just analogy after analogy after analogy. Comparing faith to faith is an act of receiving, so he compares it to as an ear to sound or an eye to light, and
Yeah.
I think he really helped me wrap my head around faith not being an active thing, but a receiving thing that takes in something from outside of us, and I thought it was a really helpful
Yeah.
explanation.
Well, good. I'm even more excited to read it now. But
He's
I
a
did love
master of
that.
illustration.
Yeah, I loved that illustration at the front end because I think it was early in the week that I listened to it and heard him say that, and I was thinking about my message and getting started on my sermon, and it just became kind of an encouragement to me through the week of the fact that I'm really dependent on God to do something with my message. Like I can do all the work on it that I can, and I try to do all the work on it that I can. And make it the best that I can. And I talked about how you and me and the conversations that we have are about preaching, are for that purpose to make each other the best preachers we can be. But at the end of the day, like I'm totally dependent on God to actually make this hit home to people in their hearts and have the effect on people's lives that He wants it to have. And so I can trust Him with that. There's a freedom in that of being able to say, God, you've got to do something with this. I might feel great about the sermon, or I might feel like, oh, it could have used more work. But either way, I'm trusting in God to do something good with it. And so I was encouraged by that.
I don't know. I like in our conversations about preaching, I often feel overwhelmed and actually kind of discouraged about it. I mean, I know, like, well, let me say this first. I think our church is probably one of the most encouraging places to preach in the whole world. I can't imagine anyone getting more encouragement than what you and I get when we preach, just by crazy kind people. But I still, there's just all these things in history, or one little comment here can come back and be like, well, it wasn't good enough. People were going to be discouraged about it being too heady or too long or too whatever. And it really, like, one negative comment can outweigh 100 positive comments. And so there's times where I just get really down about the whole preaching task. Which is weird because it's like my favorite thing to do. I love preaching, but I also can get pretty discouraged about it. And what I really liked about that quote is it says, actually quit worrying so much about the sermon itself, right, which is the fountain, and worry about the water that's in the fountain. And if the water is there, then it's sufficient to quench the thirst. And so the sermon is a delivery mechanism, but it's not the sermon that will ever quench thirst anyway. It's the water. It's the fountain just keeps that water coming through.
Right. That's right.
And I believe that the Word of God is sufficient beyond all my insufficiencies. And in that sense, my boringness or excitingness or whatever is not the really relevant part at the end of the day. So I liked it. I found that to be helpful to me. I'm going to try to keep that image in my mind.
Yeah, it's good.
All right, let's get into your actual sermon. I don't know if it was the longest passage we've had, but it was up there. It was a long passage.
Even as I was reading it, starting out, I was like, oh my goodness, there's so much here that, I'd studied and gotten, enough material for a sermon, and that's usually kind of when I decide to cut it off. And I knew there was some things in the passage that I wouldn't really address. But then reading it again just made that even all the more clear. I'm like, holy cow, there's so much here. So
I was curious if you were going to go all the way through, because it is all connected. And we'll talk about that just in a second. One of the reasons you had to is because the beginning of the passage concludes at the end of the passage. And so you know that cutting it off would have been a little bit artificial, but at the same time, it was so long. So I'll tell you from my perspective, I was thankful that you pushed on through, and it's going to allow me to start clean in chapter 20.
Yeah, for sure.
But, so let's mention that. One of the things that you did interestingly is verse 8 begins this section of the return of the king, and that's what you titled the message. Everybody's gone, everybody's fled, and now they're saying, well, why don't we bring the king back? Meaning, well, we'll talk about that in a second. Verse 10, what are they bringing him back to? But then at the end of the chapter, they're talking again, were we not the first to speak of bringing back our king? And so the this whole story is the return of the king, the bringing back of the king. Now, one of the interesting things that I kind of wondered here is in verse 8 and through 10, Israel is wanting to bring back David. And when I first read it, I thought, bring him back to Jerusalem. But that's not actually what they mean, I don't think. It's just bringing him back to the status of being king, right?
And I don't know in their minds if they had a different idea. It seems very possible they had a different idea about where David would be brought back and where he would rule from. Because once Judah gets involved, and that's what happens later on at the end of the passage, and Judah ends up being the one to go and bring David back, that is what sparks the conflict between Israel, in other words, northern tribes of Israel versus the southern tribes, which were Judah and Benjamin. And so, it seems possible the northern tribes thought we could bring him back and have him rule from somewhere else, and it'll be kind of a fresh start and even better than before or something like that. But that's not what happens, and so that's how the conflict happens. And I wanted to do that because I felt like it would be a little bit disjointed to tell half of that story first about how everybody wanted David back,
right?
And then tell all the different stories about David meeting the individuals, Shimei, Mephibosheth, Barzillai, and then come back to that issue of bringing David back. I just felt like that there would be too much distance in the message between those if I were to just take a totally linear approach to the passage. So that's why I decided to just take the beginning and the end, kind of treat them together as one kind of narrative. And that, I feel like for me, that would have made best sense as a listener to just stay in that narrative and see the beginning and conclusion of it rather than have them spread apart by a lot of other stuff. So we did the two slices of bread first, and then we dealt with the stuff in the middle. So
I found that to be really helpful. It helped me understand the flow of the passage. And maybe in a minute we'll talk about why is that flow interrupted with these three stories in your mind. But there is certainly, you have three stories in the middle of one bigger story, which is how do you take a divided kingdom that's just been at war, a civil war, and reunite the kingdom and come back as the king. And so you have the big broad narrative of David's a deposed king, but he's just one, and is he going to become king again? And then you have three small narratives, three stories inside of that bigger story. It's interesting to me, like, let's just talk a little bit about the tension of him coming back. Israel has to have a little debate. Israel, being the northern tribes, are having a debate themselves about whether or not he should come back. And their logic, what's going on in that debate? I should ask you that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you're talking about the beginning part?
Yeah, right, in the very beginning.
Yeah. I can't quite remember right off.
I'm thinking about it in verses
Take it
9
if
and
you know it.
10. I'm thinking about it in verses 9 and 10. So they're like,
Oh,
yeah,
the king
you know, the
delivered us from the
king,
hand of
and
our enemies.
he was awesome. He was great.
Yeah.
But then there seems to be this idea of like, well, but we swore ourselves to another king, to Absalom.
Right.
But the first king killed the other king, so I think we're free to take the first king back. And like, it seems like they're having some sort. It says they're arguing throughout. I read some guy say this is probably meant as like some sort of legal conversation they're having about, well,
Yeah.
how are we going to respond? But ultimately, they're like, it seems to me like, well, we kicked out the good king for a bad king, and now we're kind of ready to return to the good king.
But you're
and-
right. In verse 9, they are arguing.
Yeah.
All the people were arguing throughout all the tribes of Israel. Now, does that mean arguing in the sense of disagreeing, or just like making the argument for David?
Yeah. And I read a couple commentaries this morning just getting ready actually for next week, but more of them seem to suggest it could just be legal arguments that are going on. But that said, there's got to be some level of nervousness, and I think we'll see this later, is we did just attack this man, right? And they fled. It says now Israel, and that's probably the northern tribes, fled every man to his own home. So there's got to be some level of fear, nervousness. If we take him back, if he comes back here, how's he going to respond to us for having just attacked him?
Yeah. And so is that setting up the interactions with the three friends for you, would you say?
Yeah, for me, for sure it does.
Yeah.
I see David as believing that, and I think rightly believing, that the people are afraid he's going to come back swinging his sword at everybody who was wrong to him, right? Like, you just depose me, and I wonder, so, like, obviously it's as strange as it is that Israel's debating this. What's stranger is that his own people seem hesitant to bring him back, right? So Israel is like, yeah, it makes sense. You know, he's been a good king, and yeah, we swore to his son, but his son's dead. Let's take him back. Well, the oddity, it seems like, is verse 11. Judah themselves haven't taken him back. So to me, it seems like, well, why aren't they the first to come back to him? And I think that the most likely answer is that they're also scared of what he's going to do when he gets back to Jerusalem.
Yeah. That's a good point. Yeah, I didn't really make that connection in the message, or even have it in mind necessarily. But that does set up the interactions very nicely, because those interactions that David have show him to be exactly the opposite of who they might have thought he would be in coming back. He's merciful. He loves even his enemies, and isn't out to avenge himself.
That's right.
That's
and it may help explain some of what I think. There's some almost odd displays of mercy that almost seem to. He's very, very merciful, but in a way that sometimes creates a tension of justice. And I wonder if he is going above and beyond to say, I will not seek revenge personally. And one of the first examples of that is actually before we get to the three stories. He makes Amasa. How did you say his name? Amasa or Amasa?
Amasa, I think.
Amasa. He makes Amasa the general of the army instead of Judah.
Joab.
Instead of Joab. So I thought that was an interesting thing. Did you think much about why he did that?
It was a little bit of a bribe, and I was interested to think, what does Joab think about that? And apparently some drama goes on about that pretty soon after this.
Next week.
We'll see. I don't know. I mean, we talked a little bit earlier about whether David was really all good in this passage, or if there was some bad kind of mixed in too. And maybe in doing that, maybe in kind of doing this negotiation with Judah and bribing them a little bit, which they say afterwards, like we haven't been bribed, or they say we haven't been paid to do this, or we haven't gotten some special gift to do this. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, he did offer you to make some, one of you guys a commander, but yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
I mean, it could very possibly be something that was unwise for David to do here.
I'm thinking from Joab's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this guy just led a war against us,
mm-hmm.
and I won the war, and I get demoted for it, right? Like, this seems strange. And I was kind of thinking, I bet there's some people in our church or just everywhere who can imagine working on a team in business. And they put in extra hours, they work really hard, they get this project done, and it succeeds, it does really well. And the boss, the CEO, comes along and says, you know what, there's this one girl on the team, I'm going to promote her. And the guy says, no, listen, she didn't do any of the work. She complains incessantly. And the boss says, yeah, I know, she complains incessantly. And I feel like if I don't give her a bone here, all I'm going to hear is complaints and frustrations, and I just have to appease her in order to have some level of peace. And imagine being the guy that worked really hard and never complained, and you did all this extra work, and you're like, well, in order to shut her up, I'm going to promote her and demote you. And
mm-hmm.
I can imagine the frustration that would roll from a decision like that.
Yeah.
And I do wonder if that's going to be part of the setup for what we'll see next week. Basically, Joab's going to murder Amasa. But
he was a loose cannon.
Joab is a pretty crazy guy. But I do kind of wonder if that's what's going on. And I wonder if that's part of what, when you get to the end of the chapter, which is where you skip then those three little narratives and you go
mm-hmm.
to 41 through 43, there is peace. All the men of Israel and all the men of Judah are now united under one king. But man, it's a flimsy peace. Doesn't it seem like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because they're all mad at each other now,
mm-hmm.
and it kind of creates that sense of division that will eventually split into a formal separation into two kingdoms later on. You're already kind of seeing it here. It seems like, and again, it's about Judah having all the credit, getting all the credit, Israel feeling forgotten about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I don't know entirely what to make of it. How much of this tension is on David's shoulders because of what he does in this chapter? I do think that part of this story is just a reminder that tension is, it's an inevitability because David's not the promised king, right? So, in chapter 11, David wants to build the temple, and God says, "No, you're not going to be the forever king, right? We find out in Chronicles, you have blood on your hands. I'm going to take the kingdom from you, but I will give it to your son, and he'll be a forever king." And so we know that this isn't going to be a happy ending, right? He's not going to live forever. He's not going to be the great king forever. His son, and we know that's Jesus, will be.
Mm-hmm.
But you're seeing at the end of his life, his sins are taking its toll. The kingdom is beginning to unravel. And it really is a sad ending, not a triumphal ending. And even when he restores the kingdom, it's just barely restored. Which brought up, I think one of your application points is people of God should read this as a warning to not be divisive with each other. That the division, the arguing, the biting of each other.
Yeah.
This is, maybe it's a result of David's sin. Maybe it's a result of their own sin. Probably a combination of that. But we know regardless, it's a negative thing, right? It's like this is a bad thing. And so I think that's where you came in and said, church, why are we divided that way?
Yeah.
Why don't you explain that some more? 'Cause you brought up denominations there and some other kinds of divisions. And
yeah, just different kind of conflicts that you see even in church life. And so, seeing the people of Israel have conflict in this way is just a reminder of the fact that God's people can and will have conflict. And it is, I think, because we're in a fallen world and none of us are perfect, that it is something that's going to be inevitable, I think. But I think the point to remember is that it's about the way you handle conflict. And I wanted to really drive that home in saying that. I'm not saying that, if all our hearts are right, then we'll never have conflict or disagreement, but we will be people who know how to have those disagreements in a way that still shows that we love each other and that we're still for each other and want the best for each other. So that was kind of my general point there. But I did talk about some different ways you see conflict show up, and it can just be simple personal conflict from one person to another. One person's mad at another, and sometimes they can kind of find other friends who see it their way, and that can just kind of create factions. Another one is that I mentioned was doctrinal, which is, if somebody else doesn't believe the same things you believe, and not talking about essential Christian beliefs, but just things that are secondary, the kinds of things that Christians should be able to agree to disagree on. We can take issues like that and functionally make them primary in a way that if somebody doesn't believe the same as you, then you're suspicious of their faith altogether even. And folded into that is the denominational kind of identity thing that is a big deal for a lot of people. The our church versus their church kind of mentality, and our church is the way that Jesus really wanted it, and other churches are just doing their their man-centered thing or whatever the case may be. You have all kinds of denominational conflict, and I wanted to point out there that even Christians who are non-denominational and go to non-denominational churches like ours are not immune from that same way of thinking. Like, they can just as easily be drawn into that our church is better than every other church kind of thinking. And I mean, we should love our church. Like, I think that's a good thing for people to love their church, but it's a matter of unity and recognizing that we're not the only church, and there may be other churches that do things different ways than we do, or see things different ways than we do. But it's all for the same King, and that's the point I wanted to make with David, in that really he's a king over all the people. And there should have been a unity in that this is the man God has chosen to be king over all the people. But then the people fight about that king and who has the most claim on that king, basically.
I'm of Apollos. I'm of
right.
Paul.
Yeah, you
I'm
see it in the
Christ.
New Testament too.
Yeah.
I love the person who in that instance comes in and says, y'all are all wrong, and I'm on Team Jesus, basically, and that person is just as much part of the division and part of the problem as any of the others are. And that's similar to what non-denominational Christians can do sometimes. Like, all you sweaty Philistines out there who are, caring about your denominations, like, we're non-denominational, where you're just another kind of denominational in that sense.
Yeah.
So anyway.
It reminded me of a joke that I think you know of, Emo Phillips. Do you remember if you've ever seen the clip of Emo Phillips? He's a
you talked about this a long time ago on the podcast, I remember.
I'll do it again because he's super strange, but he's got a joke, and I have it pulled up so I can read it. Mm-hmm. It says, I was walking across a bridge one day, and I saw a man standing on the edge about to jump off. So I ran over and I said, stop, don't do it. Why shouldn't I? He said. Well, there's so much to live for. He said, like what? I said, well, are you religious or atheist? He said, religious. I said, me too. Are you Christian or Buddhist? He said, Christian. I said, me too. Are you Catholic or Protestant? He said, Protestant. I said, me too. are you Episcopalian or Baptist? He said, Baptist. I said, wow, me too. Are you Baptist Church of God or Baptist Church of the Lord? He said, Baptist Church of God. I said, me too. Are you Original Baptist Church of God or are you Reformed Baptist Church of God? He said, Reformed Baptist Church of God. I said, me too. Are you Reformed Baptist Church of God, Reformation 1879? Or Reformed Baptist Church of God, Reformation of 1915? He said, Reformed Baptist Church of God, Reformation of 1915. I said, die, heretic scum, and I pushed him off. I just think he's so weird. And I think he says, yeah, y'all are weirder because of how divided you are over such minuscule things.
Classic.
Yeah, I love that joke. But are there some right divisions?
Yeah. Surely.
At least the first one was religious or atheist is right.
Right.
Right? That first one was good.
Christian or Buddhist, yeah.
Yeah, Christian or Buddhist. That's good.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some right division.
Yeah.
How do you wrestle through that?
That's a good point, because there are even some divisions among Christians, among real Christians, that would make it best for them to be separated in terms of what church they go to.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I think of Paedo-Baptists or Presbyterians who baptize babies, basically. So we don't do that at our church. So if somebody has that conviction, I'm not saying they're not a Christian, but it probably would be best for them to go to a different church.
Right. Yeah, I think that's right. I read this morning, I told you I was reading John Frame this morning, and he talked about denominations, and he said that he believes that the Apostles' Creed says we believe in one holy Catholic church. Holy means set apart. Catholic meaning unified church, right? So there's one universal church that's all unified. And the lack of unity that shows up in denominations is, he says, always a result of sin. Sometimes the sin of the established church that makes people have to divide. Sometimes the church of the dividing people, right? So that divisions pop up because we don't all worship God rightly, whether it be because of failures of doctrine, failures of the ability to get along. There's all kinds of reasons why we could divide. But the reality of sin means that there are times in which you need to divide, where a person could say something that is innately sinful or wrong, or it could just be, we can't, something more mundane. But I'm not saying you're not a Christian, but like you said, but we got to pick one way or the other of functioning this way. And but I don't want to downplay things like baptism so much of it's just like we don't have any preference, so you just got to pick one. There are theological preferences, but I do believe that in heaven, these denominations will cease when we see things clearly and not dimly. That the unity of the church will become more prominent again, and I hope that even before the return of Christ, we'll see a growing sense of unity instead of a continuing sense of fragmentation in the church.
Amen. I hope so.
All right, so that's kind of the story of the people of Israel. David's won the battle. All of Israel and Judah were sort of unified in going against their king and joining with Absalom. But now that Absalom's dead, they are showing a kind of disunity about whether or not to go back to David, to trust him again. But they both decide they form this unhealthy allegiance. And in between this debating about whether or not to take David back and actually doing it, you have three stories that show up. Any thoughts on why that is interrupted with these three stories?
Well, I'd go back to the point you brought out already, in that they could very well be indicating and showing to us that David is not the kind of person who would be vengeful in coming back and be against the people. He's the kind of man who forgives his enemies and shows mercy. So that could be one aspect of it. I kind of reflected on how this isn't the first time we've seen this kind of thing with David in interacting with specific people who come across his path. And I just like thinking about what that says about the significance of just the simple fact of how you treat people. And, you know, that's a big part of David and how his story is told, at least, you know, within the last several chapters that we've been seeing this kind of thing. It's a significant part of his story, and probably just a little kind of brief application I made that it'll be made to that is it'll be the most significant part of our own stories too, how we treat people. You're not in control of who comes across your path or how they may treat you, but you will be in control of how you treat them, and that'll be arguably the most significant part of your own story too. So I liked thinking about that.
I thought that was a awesome point. I assume you don't mean that as so. A.W. Tozer is the one that said the most important thing about you is what you believe about God, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
and I don't think you mean like, hey, what you believe about God is not as important as what how you treat people. You don't mean that. You just mean the practical, loving people well is the outflow of your relationship with God, and it's going to affect your entire life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And other people's lives, like. You impact people and people impact you, and the story of your life will be told in the story of the interactions you have with other people.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really good and true. All right, you have three guys. First interaction is Shimei, who was a flat out jerk. You said he reminds you of these kind of
Antifa protesters or
Antifa
something.
people, yeah.
He's crazy.
He's crazy.
But he's sorry about it now.
Yeah, and do you think he really is sorry?
I tend to think not. Maybe in this moment, it's possible he could have been, like he really might have had the best intentions in this moment. But he keeps on being a problem later on. I think you read about it in Kings, where he's eventually going to be put to death by Solomon because he's still just a pain to the king. And so I don't know. He's probably a bad guy in my estimation. So I don't take much from this as far as like I don't know how much I trust his sincerity here in this moment.
Yeah.
What do you think?
No, I agree. I will say, I read John Woodhouse said that the problem is that if repentance is dependent on pure motives, repentance would never be effective because our motives are never entirely pure. And then he says, was David's motives of repenting when Nathan confronted him entirely pure, or was the threat of losing his son a driving factor? And I don't know. I don't want to read into that too much. I think David's repentance was sincere, but maybe not without mixture of self-preservation. I don't know.
And Shimei mentions 1,000 guys he brought with him, and he talks about him being the first of the tribe of Joseph to come and greet the Lord. It's almost like, I don't know, and I don't want to read too much into it if I shouldn't, but it's almost like he sees, maybe I can, if I'm first to the bat here, maybe I can make a good impression on the king and get a little something out of it.
That's right. I tend to think that he's not sincere. I tend to think that David is right to say, I can't see a man's heart, so I trust his confession.
Yeah.
And we'll let time prove it out. And I think that there is, to me, a lesson. So you and I have tons of conversations about church discipline. And I would say that for what it's worth in my mind, if ever we're in a situation where we're wrestling with whether or not a person is repentant of their sin as a church, I kind of think, well, you can't see their heart. And so you trust their confession. And there is a sense in which maybe you can prove categorically that your confession is a lie. But if there's, you say later on, like, believe all things, hope all things, like you applied 1 Corinthians 13 here. And I think David is right to believe all things and hope all things, even if there might be some question in the back of your mind.
Right. Yep. I mean, that's going to be part and parcel of forgiving your enemies and loving your enemies. Is it's not, forgiveness is not about saying, oh, they're a good person after all, and that's what, you know, the C.S. Lewis quote that I mentioned was for the purpose of showing. And I think that when I first read that, that really turned a light bulb on in my mind, because I think I did have the tendency to think about forgiveness in that way, and struggled with forgiveness sometimes for that reason, in thinking, oh, it means saying everything was okay, or it wasn't really that bad what happened to me, or the person's a good person after all, when that's not what it's about at all. And so Lewis goes into that there's a difference between hating what a person does and hating that person. So,
all right, that brings up, I kind of forgot about that, but that brings up a question that was in my mind.
Is hate the sin but love the sinner biblical?
Yeah, right, exactly. What do you think?
It's a good question, because there are times when God himself says there are individuals that he hates.
That's right.
And we just got to be honest about that. As clearly as he says, in John 3:16, God so loved the world. It's equally as clear in other parts of the Bible that there are individuals that he hates. There are times when, in the Psalms, for example, it's what's coming to my mind, maybe even Psalms of David, I can't recall right off, where he says, my soul hates those, basically, who hate the Lord. Like, people who hate the Lord, I hate them. And so what do we say about that?
Yeah. Psalm 5.
Reverend Dr. Nathaniel, what do we say about that?
Psalm 5 says, for you are not a God who delights in wickedness. Evil may not dwell with you. The boastful shall not stand before your eyes. You hate all evil doers. Mm-hmm. You destroy those who speak lies. The Lord abhors the bloodthirsty and deceitful man. Right? So, I think that I would want to steer away from acting like I am not the things I think and do. Right? So, yeah, I've done these sins, but I'm not a sinner, right? It's like, that doesn't define me. That my sin actually does define me. Like, I am what I think, and I am what I do. And as I live in sin, I incur the wrath of God, which will not be poured out merely against the things I've said and the things I've done, but against the person who said them and the person who did them. I cannot be cleanly separated from my activities in that sense. And so it would be meaningless, I think, to speak of the Lord hating the sin and loving the sinner if I meant that in such a way that the Lord's wrath will not be poured out on people who rebel against him.
For sure, yeah.
That said, I think there is, the tension seems to come in that God's hatred of sin that does get poured out on people exists at the same time as his desire to reconcile with sinners. So that there is a sense in which everything I just said is kind of untrue, and that God can see your sin and still love you and offer reconciliation and new birth and cause you to be a new creation. And so that his hatred of you, his opposition of you, does not negate his love for you and his desire to reconcile with you. And it's those two things hanging side by side, which we're trying not to negate. I do not want anyone to walk away and think God's wrath will burn against the things I did, but I'm always safe because I'm separate from those things. That our souls will go into everlasting heaven or everlasting hell, and that's me, right? That's not something outside of me. That's
right,
me.
Yeah.
At the same time, I don't want to think that God's hatred of sinners is irreconcilably opposed to his love for sinners that causes him to offer reconciliation to us. And so we just hold both of these truths together.
Yeah.
That God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And that's actually how he reconciles that. Through humility, Christ offers a sacrifice that covers our sins and washes us away. Mm-hmm. Washes our sins away, not us away.
That's good.
I don't know. Is that I don't know if that's sufficient, but that's the intention, right?
Yeah. My general view and how I think I've answered people when I get asked a question like this, and I think I have been asked it before, is hate the sin but love the sinner. Is that biblical? I think generally yes, it is, but there is more to say that goes along with it. I don't think it is necessarily misleading, but it's something that invites us into thinking about what else the Bible says along those lines, and the passages we mentioned where God does hate, and even David himself, where the psalmist says I hate those who hate the Lord. And there's a part of me. So there's a part of me that wonders if the way we use the English words love and hate kind of give us a challenge in understanding what the Bible's talking about when it uses whatever words it uses for love and hate. Because in the Bible, sometimes I do think that the word hate has more to do with rejecting. It's not about I don't know how to describe it other than say it. It's not about hating or loathing, having an emotional reaction towards someone that makes you want the worst for them and nothing but the worst for them. Like, for the way we use the words the English words love and hate, it doesn't make a lot of sense to talking about loving somebody and hating them at the same time. And so that just makes me wonder if, so like Jacob, for instance, whenever he loves Rachel and doesn't love Leah, it describes that as he loves Rachel and he hates Leah. And that seems like a little strong way to say that there. But I think in my mind, I'm wondering if hate in the Bible, and you push back against this if you think if it's not right, but if hate in the Bible has more to do with my rejection of someone, and my being opposed to someone, not necessarily, emotionally hating them, wanting the worst for them, but I'm not favorably disposed toward them. I don't know, and even trying to express that, it's hard, because no matter what way you express it, it sounds contrary to love.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know.
I think it's I think it gets very difficult for us to understand the full emotional range of God, because in all honesty, it's hard for us to understand our own full emotional range, right? Like, if God is bigger than me and I can't even understand me, right? Like, how much less am I going to capture that?
And
I don't want
to. That's probably true. That God is able to have a complex emotional life within Himself that is just beyond us, because He's beyond us.
Yeah, I don't want to go to a degree where I make God a non-emotional being, right? Because then I would really struggle to have any concept of what it means for the Lord to delight Himself in anything. Like, the Lord does delight, and He finds wrath, which I could say settled opposition, which is I think a okay definition. But I think there is grieving the Holy Spirit. There is delighting the Lord. And so there's some sort of emotional experience that God has that is higher and better and more full than ours. but the Bible uses emotional language to describe him. I also think it's a helpful but maybe not complete description to talk about a parent whose love for their children will create a settled opposition to the things they do while they still love their children. And so Alistair Begg this week was talking about anyone who has a child that has been involved in drugs will hate everything about drugs and drug use because they've seen the way it destroys their lives. And they still love their children. And that's true. But there is some sense in which God's settled opposition, we might even be able to recognize that in that a person who genuinely loves their children may turn their own children into the police to be arrested. They may take a settled opposition toward their own children for their children's sake. And so you could even say that is true about God, that his love for his children creates a settled opposition against whom he, anything that opposes them. But then I think at the same time we have to say, the Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated passages, which are hard for us, still say that there is an eternal reconciliation that some people experience and an eternal opposition that is not reconciliatory. Esau does not seem to be reconciled to God, that his opposition to Esau is eternal, and to Jacob is not. He opposes Jacob's sin, but he also purges his sin, and he changed Jacob. And I don't know. I don't know how much more. I'm not sure if I'm being clear, but I don't know if I can be more clear either.
Join the club.
So I do like that you said anyone who tries to tell you to take vengeance. You begin talking about Abishai.
Yeah.
They're your adversary, right? He says, "Get behind me, you sons of Zeruiah," and you're like, "Get behind me, Satan." And so, I think that's interesting, that connection that you made between him and Peter.
Yeah, I really, and that point didn't strike me honestly till the morning of, as I was going back through my message. I didn't make a big deal out of that detail, but the morning of, it's like it struck me as pretty important, and I found myself dwelling on it a lot. So it came out more so in the sermon.
Well, let's move on. I mean, I think there's still more we could say about that, but we've already been here for a while, and I think the more interesting conversation is actually Mephibosheth, because he's your favorite person in the Bible. But also, what a crazy story. So Mephibosheth, the first person that he reconciles with is Shimei. Maybe we just barely skimmed that, but the 1,000 men. Hey, can we be at peace? David just has a desire to show the entire kingdom, Judah and Israel, I'm not going to come back to you as your king and bring the sword on everybody. He's eager to forgive sins and to reconcile his kingdom. He is bent toward mercy. And so we see that work itself out in Shimei. And we're kind of like, okay, no harm, no foul there, except for maybe Abishai's a little offended because he threw stones at Abishai too, and he spit and cursed at Abishai too. But on the whole, no harm, no foul. Mephibosheth's story comes in, and it's a little bit of a different situation. He has this question for Mephibosheth: "Why didn't you come with me?" And Mephibosheth tells him, "I wanted to, but I got tricked. I was deceived by my servant." And why am I blanking on his name all of a sudden?
Ziba.
Ziba. He says, I'm deceived by Ziba, and this is what has really thrown me off now. And so, slanderous, and David basically says, all right, let's split the difference. Ziba, you get half the kingdom, or you get half of Saul's estate.
Yeah.
Mephibosheth, you get half the Saul's estate. And I'll be honest with you, I read that, and I'm like, well, that's not right.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So what happened there?
Right. Which is significant because, like, I think that may be natural and maybe all the more reason to be impressed with Mephibosheth and how he responds after that.
For sure.
He says, let him take it all. I don't need any because I've got my Lord the King back safely home. But anyway, I do think that's a good point you bring up. I don't know what the legal kind of situation may have been here. Honestly, I think it was kind of strange earlier on, whenever David was leaving Jerusalem, and he's being driven out of the city because he's no longer going to be king anymore, but yet he still makes this some kind of legal declaration for Ziba to be able to have all of Mephibosheth's stuff. And so like I wasn't sure kind of how that worked either. And in a similar way, I'm not sure what is going on here as far as why David just makes a decision to split the difference. I wonder if from a legal perspective, it's kind of just turns out to be a one person's word against another. And so maybe, I don't know, I think judges sometimes even today are kind of conflicted, and they may feel a certain way about what's actually right, but they have to do what the law says. Yeah. And so maybe that's kind of playing into what David does here. Like, this is the best I can do legally in this one person's word against another kind of thing. I think he trusts Mephibosheth and believes that Ziba did lie about Mephibosheth, but maybe this is the best he can do. That was my idea.
Yeah. I don't know either. I mean, I will say I find it a disappointing thing. Some people, one person said, maybe David doesn't know who to trust. I saw several people think that, and I feel like the text is written in a way that makes us believe, no, we know who to trust. It's Mephibosheth here. Yeah. So the idea that David didn't know who to trust, I just don't feel like the text is leading us in that direction. Some people said, and I find this more persuasive, is that in spite of the dishonesty, at the end of the day, Ziba still helped David, right? Ziba he was manipulative, he was doing wrong things, but he was still a tool of God to bring the provision of God to David at a hard time. And so David's going to acknowledge that, like, God blessed me through Ziba. Mm-hmm. And so maybe that's part of what's going on here. And I do think the other thing is that David's overarching goal in these three stories is to say, I'm merciful and kind. I'm not coming here with vengeance and setting everything right. I'm coming here to try to bring unity and peace. And to me, this is where actually the hero of this story is Mephibosheth, like you said, not David is not, I'm not trying to say he's wrong here, but the hero of the story is Mephibosheth, because he's saying the reward of the kingdom is less important to me than the reward of the king.
Mm-hmm. Right.
All right, we had a little camera issue, but I think I'm back on now, and so we'll just roll with
good.
it.
Looking good.
So anyway, I like Mephibosheth's response. He says, the king is more important to me than the kingdom, right? The king is more important to me than what I get for following the king. Mm-hmm. And in my mind, Mephibosheth then gives us a picture of true faith, right? He is the opposite, I think, of the older brother who is, in the story of the Good Samaritan. Yeah. Why in the world would you show mercy to this person? Mephibosheth is just so consumed that he is the younger brother. He was the one that received mercy. He is not worried one bit if somebody else gets mercy, right, as long as he gets to be with the king. And so I really view him as the hero of the story. That was one of your questions, is how is Mephibosheth a picture of ourselves, and how is he showing us humility? Right. And I think that's the most exciting part of the story, probably.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just the picture he is of our own brokenness in sin, our own unworthiness, the fact that we are debtors to God for his grace and for everything that we have. And so that totally pulls the rug out from underneath any sense of entitlement we might naturally want to have in our hearts. Mephibosheth just has none of that. And that's why I love him, and I'm challenged by him and want to be like him when I grow up.
Yeah. I agree. I think he is one of the few people who have zero downsides in this story, except for all of his physical limitations. Yeah. But as far as on a spiritual level, he is just a very honorable guy. The last guy you didn't spend much time on, Barzillai. Nope. You said not Godzilla, which I appreciated that. I felt like that was a nod to me.
Yeah, you.
And so you didn't spend much time because it wasn't a big deal. I do think,
Well, that's what the podcast is good for. We can
we can
spend
talk
more
about
time
him.
talking about this dude.
But there's no need to reconcile it. Like the other two guys had these like weird history. Like this story in my mind doesn't fit easily with the first two. The first two, there was some sort of conflict, and how am I going to resolve this? Who gets punished? Who doesn't get punished? With Barzillai, it's just, here's a good guy, and what can I do for you? And the good guy says, it wasn't what I could do for you. I'm just what you could do for me. I was just happy to serve you. But he does ask for his son, right? To go with him.
Yeah.
Is that right? My son?
Chimham.
Yeah.
He just calls him here is your servant, Chimham.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe it isn't his son.
It could be a son, though.
So, but anyway, any thoughts on the significance of this story?
I had a couple ideas in the message. I'm just wondering if maybe Barzillai is a picture of contentment, like he's fine with who he is and where he is, and he doesn't need any kind of special treatment, and he just wants to go and live out the rest of his days back home. Or if he's a picture of selflessness, somebody who wants to be a blessing to other people and isn't concerned at all, and in fact will refuse any kind of perceived repayment that they might get from somebody. He just wants to, take whatever opportunities he can to be a blessing, and then let it, just be okay with that, and not doesn't need anything in return. So I don't know. I mean, if you have any other
I think one of the
ideas,
things that makes
go ahead.
One of the things that makes this challenging for me is that the first two stories, I focused my mind a lot on whether David was right and what is David doing in these. And the third story seems to be some of that, but a lot more of the focus is on Barzillai. So if I go back and I refocus the stories on the people he's interacting with more than just David, Shimei becomes this example of repentance, right? Whether or not it's entirely sincere, there is this idea that if you are opposed to the king, but you humble yourself and you turn to the king, he receives you. And then you have Mephibosheth, who is this picture of a guy who says, I wasn't, I wasn't there in all the middle of the king's thing, but I'm loyal to the king and I love him. I want to be with the king. And is a picture of discipleship to the king. And Barzillai is a guy who says, I did serve him, but I didn't serve him because I gained something. I served him because he was the king and he was worthy of it. And like you said, he's this model of contentment that I'm not serving him because this was my ticket to richness.
Right.
I'm happy with the lot I have, and I'm happy with this king, and I serve him because he's good, and that's it.
Where does Jesus talk about the servants who they say in the end, we only did what was required of us, or how's it worded? I'm blanking now.
I'm not sure what
servants.
passage.
I'll find it, but go on.
No, I mean that was kind of where I was at with him.
Yeah.
Barzillai is an interesting thing, but I do think it is at least neat, and I don't know who Chimham is exactly, but there does seem to be a blessing to maybe his offspring or people connected to him because of his faithfulness there, and so.
Yeah. It's Luke 17, by the way, I think. Jesus says, when you have done everything you were told to do, you should say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done our duty. So there shouldn't be that sense of, okay, we did what we were told to do, so we need to earn something in return. No, it's the sense of, no, we're unworthy servants, and we've only done what was our duty to do. And we don't need anything in return. Anyway, I think Barzillai is, and how you mentioned the three persons is interesting because Shimei is somebody who's clearly an enemy of David, I would say. Mephibosheth is somebody who it's kind of not clear whether he's an enemy or not in in terms of David's perspective and what he had heard and trying to sort that out, there's a question there of Mephibosheth's loyalty, at least at the start.
In the story.
And Barzillai is somebody who there's no question really. He's just always been good to David, and it's like I don't know. There's a consistent treatment that David has toward these people in believing the best for them or wanting the best for them, doing what he can for the best for them, despite who they are, whether there's somebody who's been good to him, somebody he's not sure whether they're good or bad, or somebody they're clearly bad. Like it's all kind of the same response from David. He blesses them in some way.
Let me wrap up the conversation by taking us back to how you ended the sermon. I loved it how you said, hey, it's hard to read this and not see a connection with the Lord's Supper here. And you specifically went to verse 28, for all my father's house were but men doomed to death before my Lord the King, but you set your servant among those who eat at your table.
Yeah.
That's Mephibosheth's words.
Right.
And so you said, hey, I see that as a connection with communion. Flesh that out for me.
For sure, yeah. Well, first he says, for all my father's house were but men doomed to death. And, of course, he's speaking about being part of Saul's house and naturally thinking, I deserve nothing but death, and probably David is going to give me death in just wanting to wipe out Saul's house. But that's not what David does. And so Mephibosheth has that in mind. For us, I think we could say something very similar, because our first father, Adam, is the one who, death entered the world through Adam and his sin. And so we are of our father's house in a sense, in that we are naturally of Adam. And so for that reason, we deserve death. So we can see ourselves there too. But despite the fact that we deserve death, Christ has invited us in to eat at his table, just like David, as a type of Christ, does that here for Mephibosheth. And Christ has taken we who are his enemies, and he's turned us into his friends and given us a seat at his table. And I think that's part of the beauty of communion and what we celebrate in partaking of it.
Yeah, that's great. As we were thinking about that, I sort of wondered if the way we do communion maybe could possibly obscure some of the imagery here, that especially that talks about the use of the word table, right? And so we always pass out individual. There is no table here, right? And so, but I mean, it is part of Christian tradition to call the Lord's Supper the Lord's table. Right? We see that connection. What does the word table imply in your mind? And I don't know. Just flesh that out a little bit. What do you think?
Implies unity. It implies togetherness. Somebody you invite to your table is somebody you are opening up to on an emotional level and kind of wanting to bless them.
Right. Yeah,
I mean, it implies good things in that way. And I think that's part of the reason why Jesus was criticized for eating with sinners. There's that sense that people you eat with are people that you are friends with and people you want to associate with and in a positive way. And I'm not saying that, people were wrong or people were right to accuse Jesus in that way, but you still see that sense of unity there in eating together.
Yeah, I think that's right. The Lord's Supper and baptism as well are these huge symbolic acts, and it is almost impossible to touch on all the different facets, right? If you think of it as a diamond that has facets all over, little sides to it that gleam light from each direction, almost never can we mention all of them at any single time. But there is this sense of, man, I was invited to dine with the Lord, to sit at his table. And we I just feel like because we're using basically the COVID cups that where you don't all have to come to the same table
the
anymore.
lunchable version. Yeah.
Like, it might be, especially if you haven't grown up in the church, you may miss the idea that this was actually meant to picture one loaf that we're all sharing, one drink that we're all sharing that represents one table and one big meal that the Lord has invited us all into as his family. And I think that your connection of this verse of what Mephibosheth is saying to the Lord's table, or to the Lord's Supper, is really good, because it is supposed to be to us mind-blowing that God would call people who were his enemies and make them his friends. And I really think that, I like that you ended there, because I do think that that is the silver thread, or the golden thread, that has tied this whole chapter together. You did have Shimei, who was clearly an enemy, and he showed him mercy. You had Ziba and Mephibosheth, who Mephibosheth, we're like, is he an enemy? Is he not an enemy? But Mephibosheth himself declares, hey, I was Saul's son, right? Like, so this story may have been him not being an enemy, but Mephibosheth's self-declaration is that I'm an enemy who's been brought to the king's table. And then Barzillai, he's a foreigner. He's an old man who doesn't live in Israel. He is a man who is old and unable to do much anymore at this point, except for, he did bring some stuff to David. But David is loyal to him and invites him in, and not only invites him in, but I'm assuming Chimham's family is inviting his family in, right? So he's bringing in his descendants. And that this whole thing is a sign of David's, after David is mistreated, David doesn't respond in mistreatment. He welcomes his enemies to his table. And I think that's why you're ending with, hey, I see this as a picture of the gospel and of God. While we were still sinners, he died for his enemies. And that through all of these stories, we should see the inviting hand of Christ reconciling himself to sinners, to people. He came to his own, and his own received him not, and still he died for his own, and he calls his own to come to him. And that there's a love of Christ for people who don't love him.
Mm-hmm. That's great. It's really good.
I thought you did a great job, man. I
enjoyed it.
A super long passage.
Yeah.
The one thing that is still sitting in my mind on this, and I don't know how much it'll come up next week, is another verse. It says, "What does the Lord," Micah 6:8, "what does the Lord require of you, O man, except for to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God?" And I think in this passage we saw that David loved mercy. We see, I think he tried, I don't know if he succeeded in doing justice. And the ability of human beings to keep that simple thing, to do justice and love mercy, feels almost impossible. And I think that perhaps that's part of what sets up the next conflict that we're going to see in the next chapter. But that's why David is ultimately not the ultimate king, right? We have to wait until his son, Jesus, comes and actually does justice perfectly and shows mercy perfectly. And it's through that he's able to actually unify. I think a passage that the passage you chose was great, right? So I'm not trying to say you should have chose this one, but another parallel passage that you could have chose is Ephesians 2:11 through 22, where he says, "You were once Gentiles. You were separated from Christ, from the alienated from the commonwealth. You're strangers to Israel and the covenants of promise. But he came and he preached peace to you who were far off, and preached peace to those who were near. And through him we have access to one Spirit, to the Father. So you're no longer strangers and aliens." And in any way, my point is that he takes people who were irreconcilably divided, and by doing justice and showing mercy, he's able to bring a unity that David wasn't able to bring. And so that's why we're going to see David's kingdoms continue to fragment, continue to fail, because as good as David was, he couldn't do what Jesus does, which is full justice and full mercy. Only
good.
Jesus does that.
It's good.
All right, man.
Enjoyed it, man, as always.
I enjoyed it. We'll do it next week. The last little thing to mention, the building is coming along incredibly. I went over to see it yesterday while we were talking. Amy called me, and when we get off, I'm going to call her back. But for any of you guys that listen, if you haven't been to see the building recently, you don't understand how much work has been done. We need to be thanking Johnny Milton. He has done an incredible amount of work. Amy, Don Blanton has done an incredible amount of work. Oleg has finished out the countertops, and that's great. Jim has done an incredible job with the floors. Robert Connor put in tons of work doing the trim. Him and Amy did that together. It just is looking great. I don't know for sure. We got some things going on this week that will tell us, but it is possible that we're close to a month out of being in that building. So I don't know. I just wanted to take the chance to say I'm excited and also overwhelmingly thankful. All of what has been done. Yeah, it's been a group effort, but there's been, I really think, a heroic effort, and especially with Johnny Milton and Amy Blanton and some other people that I just mentioned. So thankful for it, and it's looking great, and I'm excited. We'll be there soon.
Awesome. Praise the
I'll
Lord.
let y'all know, everybody know, if there's more work to be done. I think I'm going to go plant some plants today, but I'm hoping I can get that done mostly by myself.
Cool.
All right, see you guys.
All right, man. See ya.
Bye.